this is our third meeting. The first one was the life of Ignatius, which would give us a historical background. And last week we looked at Ignatian prayer. But I said at the time that last meeting, this one, and next month's all fit together. It's like trying to do the same thing in three different ways. So one can't be fully understood without the other. So we looked at Ignatian prayer on the whole notion of finding God in all things, trusting our own experience, which is where we start tonight. And we looked at very briefly at what the spiritual exercises were about, and we mentioned things like discernment, but we didn't say too much about them. And so we come tonight to discernment of spirits. Now, there are two elements to Ignatian discernment. One is discernment of spirits, and the other is discerning God's will. They're very, very much linked to each other, but they have to be looked at really separately. And so, having looked at Ignatian prayer, we're going to look at discernment of spirits. The foundational experience here we looked at in the first meeting, but I just quote you a little bit from the autobiography. And I was reading this just now, that there are one or two typing errors, but you'll forgive me for that. Remember the situation in Loyola, where he's recovering, almost died, but he's dealing with the aftermath of the cannonball hitting him in Pamplona. He has nothing to read, so he reads the lives of the saints and the life of Christ, and he begins to notice something. But it took time, and what it says in the autobiography is this: he paid no attention to this, nor did he stop to weigh the difference, until one day his eyes were opened and he began to wonder at the difference and to reflect on it, learning from experience. The highlight is from me, not from him. That one kind of thought left him sad and the other cheerful. This step by step, that should be thus. Thus, step by step, he came to recognise the difference between the two spirits that moved him. So that was the whole thing in embryo. That's how it began. He just noticed something in himself, and he took that experience seriously. And we looked at two pictures. That's the room in Loyola where all this happened. That's the other version of it, which is taken from the pictures around the wall. And that's the River Carbonare, which we saw in the first evening. And it was walking along the River Carbonare while he was in Manresa that he had this moment of tremendous insight, where he says that God showed him more in that moment than he had taught him in the rest of his life. And although it's not entirely clear what that revelation was, most... Come in. Very welcome. It's pretty generally accepted that it was the kind of stuff that we're going to look at now. So, as I said, he took his own experience seriously and he trusted it. But he also tested it. And those two things are vital to everything we're going to talk about tonight. He took his own experience seriously and trusted it, but he also tested it. Because running through the whole business of discernment of spirits is the constant possibility of self-delusion, as well as all the prejudices and the preconceived ideas and the unconscious things that are going on inside us which are influencing us without realising it. So it's not just a case of believing everything that goes on inside yourself. I mean, the world's full of fanatics who do that. Who never question anything that goes on inside themselves. Everything that happens to them is the truth, and everything they think is the truth, and every thought they have is from God, and they know, and you can't tell them anything, because that's trusting your experience, but not testing it, because it has to be constantly tested, and that's what discernment of spirits is about. I just thought I'd throw in that wee quote from the first letter of St. John. My dear friends, not every spirit is to be trusted, but test the spirits to see whether they're from God. for many false prophets are at large in the world. That's why, for some people, I remember an example of this. I hadn't thought of this till now, but I'm going to mention his name, and that was Tom Winning. Tom Winning was very suspicious of Ignatian spirituality, because he was afraid that folk would start to think for themselves. He belonged to a club, which wanted to tell people what the truth was and tell people what to do. And he was very uncomfortable with any of his priests who get involved in spiritual exercises and so on, because he didn't want them to lose control over them. And of course, in that sense, he's typical of a whole history in the church. But it was very much a response to the age in which he lived, and it's linked to this whole business of Tom Winning, really, because Tom Winning just came into my head, because apart from alone in that. But what we have to remember about the world Ignatius was living in, was mainly that the Reformation was going on. But the Reformation didn't come out of nowhere. We had things like the printing press, which everybody recognises was a huge factor in it, because through the printing press, ideas began to spread. There was a whole new development whereby people were starting to think for themselves, because all this tumult of ideas was causing debate, and the Reformation was all about that, and the Reformation was about people reading the scriptures themselves. Up to that point, they hadn't been able to read the scriptures, which is why, of course, when you go to the big cathedral churches and others in Europe, you have all these images of the scriptures, because they were the catechism. People saw these great retablos behind the altars in churches and so on, and that's where they got their story of Christ from, not from reading the Bible, but from pictures all around them. And all that changed, so people had a whole new access to knowledge and information. And so the whole question started to arise about how do you live in that world? How do you sort things out for yourself? How do you decide what you're going to do, what you believe, what you think, as opposed to what the church had been telling people for centuries? And so Ignatius is responding to a great need in his own time, but it's also a great need, I would suggest, in the world that we live in as well, because, to use a phrase that I've used many, many times in my life, we live in a world where there are 1,000 versions of the truth. Everybody's peddling a version of the truth. You just have to switch on television to hear that. And again, as in Ignatius' time, individuals have to try to live discerning lives in that world. To try and live out of our own in ourselves, not to be dictated to by the media what we think and what we're going to do and what we should wear and what we should eat and all the rest of it. We have to, if we're going to be mature adults, live from a place inside ourselves. Be the people that we are created to be, not to become robots controlled by others. And so this whole question of discernment, of sifting through things, of sifting through our experiences, and trying to separate the wheat from the chaff, is as big a need today as it was in Ignatius' time. Does that seem true? By the way, any time, just stop me if you want to ask anything. We should have said that. And discernment is in fact an act of faith, because it's based there on two truths. One is belief in a God who communicates directly with us, and the second is the conviction that it's possible to know what that God is saying to us. Now, if we don't accept any one of those two, either of them, then what Ignatius says about discernment, it will make no sense. If you're relying on people from outside of yourself to tell you what the truth is all the time, you're looking to authority figures, or you're looking to the government, or you're looking to the clergy, or you're looking to the church, or you're looking to anybody at all who's peddling the truth, if that's where you're trying to find a truth, this wouldn't make sense. if you live in the world of religion, for example, as opposed to the world of faith, this won't make sense. Because the idea that God is communicating directly to each one of us inside ourselves is difficult for many people to take on board. Even although we learned as children that we're temples of the Holy Spirit, is that true, or do we believe it? And even if it is true, is it possible for us to discern, to know what it is God is saying to us? And Ignatian discernment, we call it discernment because there are other traditions that have discernment, not as developed as Ignatius, but that's the basis on which it works. So that's the first question, in a sense, to ask ourselves tonight. Do you believe that God communicates directly with you? And if so, do you believe that it's possible to know what He's saying? Because if you do, then that's what discernment will help you with. We said that He trusted His experience. So what do we mean by that? Basically, we mean that we expect to meet God in everything that happens to us. That's what we talked about the last time. That no experience is wasted if we discern, if we try to identify the source of it. Where's it coming from? Where is it taking us? Is it good or is it not good? Because the experience in itself is just an experience. But it's by sifting through it all that we can begin to make sense of it. So it's everything that happens to us. It's that spaghetti junction of thoughts, feelings, inclinations, desires, moods, everything that happens in us in the course of any given day, as well as all the stuff that happens outside of ourselves. I talk here about different forms of knowledge. The importance of feelings are central to this, because it's taking seriously what's going on inside us. It goes beyond cold rationality. Something, as I've written there, is now taken for granted in most modern schools of counselling and psychotherapy. Because, I mentioned this at Mass briefly on Sunday, at the end, for hundreds of years, people lived in a world filled with superstition and magic and religious mumbo-jumbo and all kinds of stuff. And then along came the Enlightenment and the age of reason, and suddenly reason was going to solve all our problems. If we abandoned all that superstitious nonsense and we embraced reason, everything would create a perfect world. Until along came people like Hitler and Stalin and all the rest of it, and we didn't have a perfect world. But we're still kind of living in that world. Beyond reason lie other ways of knowing. I mean, just think of it. If you can only know what reason can tell you, then we'll be pretty limited. There's a whole other world, other ways of knowing things. And I'm going to give a couple of examples of here, just to show how this different way of knowing is so central to much of our culture today. Gestalt therapy, which some of you may have experienced, it has that thing in common with Ignatian spirituality. It's utterly rooted in taking people's present experience seriously. And basically that's what happens. People are encouraged to explore their feelings, they're encouraged to explore what's happening to them. Being able to self-validate this, Philip Simkin says, he's one of the key writers on it, to develop what is the correct solution through one's own body language is a tremendous help in the economy of psychotherapy. Many of the transference difficulties can be avoided, as well as the pitfalls of interpretation, through teaching oneself and one's patients how to use their symptoms, how to listen to their own body language, and a lot more as well. Carl Rogers, the father of person-centered counselling, my total organismic sensing of a situation, he says, is more trustworthy than my intellect. As I come to trust my total reactions more deeply, I find I can use them to guide my thinking. I think of it as trusting the totality of my experience, which I have learned to suspect is wiser than my intellect. And that's what Ignatius was talking about at the Cardinal, he saw something that was far beyond the reason. It breaks through all that, and there's intuition, there's revelation, there's insight. And I'm sure you've all had such experiences. Would that be true? Women are supposed to be more intuitive than men, but whether that's... Would you agree that that is important?
Yes.
When you walk into a house, for example, and you sense what's going on, that's not reason, is it?
Yeah.
And it's very reliable. One of the things I've been encouraged to do over the last 24 years is to trust my intuition. And I've found that more often than not it's right. Because we know things in other ways than just reason. It's one of the things I've always been very aware with people with severe learning difficulties. It doesn't mean that they don't experience God, and it doesn't mean that they don't understand things that we don't understand, because there are other ways of knowing things. And Ignatius is very much hundreds of years before his time, of course. He was a genius in that sense, but understood this, that it's a total experience, and that feelings are hugely important. It doesn't mean to say you have to act on them all, but if you want to know what's going on inside you, you have to take them seriously. And then that fellow Goldman wrote a book called Emotional Intelligence. You hear quite a lot now about emotional intelligence, as opposed to just intellectual intelligence. I'll just read it to you. While strong feelings can create havoc in reasoning, and that's certainly the case. I mean, if you're in a foul mood, your reasoning can, I guess, a bit distorted. The lack of awareness of feeling can also be ruinous, especially in weighing the decisions on which our destiny largely depends. What career to pursue, whether to stay with a secure job or switch to one that is riskier, but more interesting. Whom to date or marry, where to live, which apartment to rent or house to buy, etc. Such decisions cannot, he says, be made well through sheer rationality. They require gut feeling and the emotional wisdom garnered through past experiences. Formal logic alone can never work as the basis for deciding who to marry or trust, or even what job to take. And again, I've highlighted this. These are realms where reason without feeling is blind. So Ignatius is talking about this in the 16th century, and he calls it deep interior knowledge. Does that phrase make sense to you? Deep interior knowledge. It's kind of deep interior knowledge. You can, at one level of yourself, you can say this is beyond belief, and at another level of yourself, you can know it's true. Because it's a deep interior knowledge. So now we come to Ignatius's rules for discernment for the first and the second weeks. This will become clear, I hope, before we're finished. He's talking about the first week of the exercises and the second week of the exercises. He says they are rules for understanding to some extent, so they're not hard and fast rules. This is not everything that can be said about it. But the rules for understanding to some extent the different movements produced in the soul, and for recognizing those that are good, to admit them, and those that are bad, to reject them. So that's what discernment of spirits is about. So it's sifting through our experience, taking it all seriously, acknowledging it, looking at it, and figuring out for ourselves which ones are taking us in a good, healthy direction and which ones are taking in a bad direction, and to try to follow that. Because, of course, often we don't do that. We act out of the worst part of ourselves, and the results are rarely, if ever, good. There's a common misapprehension. I remember I've been at a meeting a couple of years ago in Cumnock with the priest, and there was a priest from Paisley whom I used to teach in Blair's. A very clever guy. But he said, I just had to pick him up and tell him he was talking nonsense. No, because he said that a Jesuit in Rome had told him that if you feel good about something, then it's from God. I mean, what a ludicrous idea. What a dangerous idea. That if you feel good about it, then it's from God. God, you could justify anything on those grounds. But that's what he thought Ignatian discernment was about. If it feels good, do it, which was the Rolling Stones, of course. You see, and people often, with the exercises, miss out Ignatius's first two rules, because it's absolutely, I don't want to spend too much time on this, but it's absolutely vital that we understand what he's saying in the first two rules, because he's talking about two different persons, two different kinds of people. The first one is those who go, as he puts it in his 16th century language, from one mortal sin to another, right? So this person's general direction of this person's life is away from God, right? That's the general direction. So for that person, if that person comes into contact with the Spirit of God, then there will be turmoil because they're meeting each other head on. You understand what I mean? That person's moving in that direction and the Spirit's inviting them to go in that direction, so there'll be turmoil and problems. It's like a ship sailing into the wind. Whereas that person who's heading away from God, when he or she meets the bad spirit, they'll be comforted by it. There won't be any turmoil. And a classic example, the obvious kind of example, would be the alcoholic. Some of you may be alcoholics. Whether you're probably sober if you're here, but you might not be. The alcoholic who's struggling with drink, it's the good spirit that challenges him. The bad spirit says, just have a drink, won't make any difference. The Spirit of God at that point would cause some kind of conflict. What Ignatius actually says, in the case of those who go from one mortal sin to another, the enemy is ordinarily accustomed to propose apparent pleasures. He fills their imagination with sensual delights and gratifications, the more readily to keep them in their vices and increase the number of their sins. With such persons, the good spirit uses a method which is the reverse of the above. Making use of the light of reason, he will rouse the sting of conscience and fill them with remorse. Now, Ignatius doesn't have anything else to say really about that situation, because this is part of the exercises, and he's taking it for granted that nobody in that state is doing the spiritual exercises. So what he goes on to talk about is the person who is striving to conform himself or herself to the will of God, that desire for God. So everything he says after that is based on that premise. But it's very important to understand that first rule, because if my priest friend had understood that, he wouldn't have said such rubbish as if it feels good, it's from God. Anyway, Ignatius goes on to talk about the person who is seeking God. Although it is very important, I don't want to get too pernickety about this, but if we're looking at the overall direction of a person's life, it's perfectly possible that the overall direction of their life is towards God, but there might be a little pocket where it's not. Understand? There might be an area where they're resisting the movement of God, in which case everything turns on its head, and so the discernment of spirits would be different in that situation. Does that make sense to you? Or not? Right. Anyway, consolation and desolation. And we're talking here about spiritual consolation and spiritual desolation. I'm not going to say too much about consolation because the rules for the first week are all about how to deal with desolation. So we'll look at what desolation is. And if I had a pound for every time I quoted these words to people. Spiritual desolation, see if you've ever felt this, maybe you're feeling it just now. Darkness of soul, turmoil of spirit, inclination to what is low and earthly, restlessness rising from many disturbances and temptations, which lead to want of faith, want of hope, and want of love. The soul is always slothful, tepid, sad, and separated, as it were, from its Creator and Lord. Have you ever felt any of that stuff? Yeah. There's nothing wrong with spiritual desolation in the sense that it's part and parcel of what it is to be human. So it's not, because you're feeling that way, it's not very pleasant. It can cause you and others a lot of bother, but there's nothing wrong with it, if you know what I mean. You know, that's what happens to human beings sometimes. So there will be times in your life when you're in spiritual desolation, but Ignatius' rules are about what you do when that happens. It's not about stopping it happening, because he says consolation and desolation are like day and night. One just follows the other. Sometimes you're in one and sometimes you're in the other. You just have to live with that fact. But what do you do or what do you not do? Well, there's the question there. First thing, I'll simplify the rules. Never make any decisions. Couldn't be simpler than that. Never make decisions when you're in spiritual desolation. Never make decisions. And if only we could stick to that, what a difference it would make. Never make decisions, because if you do, you're letting what Ignatius would call the bad spirit guide you. Satan, if you like, in 16th century language, becomes your spiritual director. If you make decisions under the influence of spiritual desolation. So you never make decisions. If you've made a decision, if you have another decision to look at, and you want to change it, you wait till you're in consolation. You can only make decisions when you're in consolation. And one of the other things he says is, no matter how bad spiritual desolation is, you always have enough grace to, you always have enough sense to act properly if you really want to, if your will is strong enough. So you make your decisions in consolation. If you come into desolation, you stick to them, you know, like somebody strapping themselves to a wheel in an old sailing ship during the storm. You don't change direction, you just wait till it passes, and then if you want to review the decision, you do it when you're back into consolation. Also, not only do you not make any decisions, but you act against it. If it's pushing you in one direction, you use your will to go in the other direction. You act against it. Very simple stuff. And you remember that consolation will return. Now, it's very hard to believe that sometimes. Because if you're in spiritual desolation, nothing else seems real. I mean, it's not kid on, it's not a kid on thing. When you're in it, it's the only thing you can see. Nothing else makes any sense. That's why you're in no position to make any decisions. That's why you're in no position to do anything except just wait till it passes and act against it. Because the quicker you act against it, the better. As I've said, make decisions during times of consolation and stick to them when desolation comes. Ignatius says a few other things about desolation. And there's one of them. Spiritual desolation, he says, is like a low man that should be. Of course, he's writing in the 16th century. You have to understand what he's talking about. I used to wonder exactly what he was saying, and some of you have heard this before. I understood it one day in Zamora, in Spain. I was with some friends, and we sat down outside a bar to bite a lunch. And a big group started coming from across the street. They had obviously been to some family celebration. So they come over and they started to pull tables together and all that kind of stuff. And there was a matriarchal figure there, and she started, you know, it's like winding up a siren. And she completely and utterly dominated everybody. She ruled, everybody sat where she told them to sit, everybody did exactly what. I mean, she should have been in charge of an army, but I mean, can you picture that high-pitched voice that Italians and Latins do when they get like that? And I thought to myself, that's what Ignatius is talking about. what he means by it, of course, is he could have used other images, and of course, and he lived in the 21st century, no doubt he would. But what he means is this: you must never let desolation pick up speed. You know, you have to deal with it quickly. You have to deal with it instantly. I mean, I could read what he says, and it's not very complimentary to women, but I'll read it anyway.
You're very brave.
It's a bit
You're very brave.
No, I mean, he says
Is this a mistake, Joe?
Act quickly.
I don't know, we should read this.
No, come on, I need to do it now.
Come on.
It says, the enemy conducts himself as a woman. He's a weakling before a show of strength, and a tyrant if he has his will. It is characteristic of a woman in a quarrel with a man to lose courage and to take to flight if the man shows that he is determined and fearless. However, if the man loses courage and begins to flee, the anger, vindictiveness and rage of the woman surge up and know no bounds. Is there truth in that?
Yeah.
Absolutely,
Good man.
In the same way, he says, the enemy becomes weak, loses courage and turns to flight with his seductions as soon as one leading a spiritual life faces his temptations boldly and does exactly the opposite of what he suggests. And the image I always use is, I've said it again so many times over the years, it's like if the desolation comes to your door and you open the door and invite it in, and sit it down and give it a cup of tea. But the ages to get rid of. You have to do it quickly. You have to learn quickly to react against desolation, because the quicker you act against it, the less power it will have over you. Very simple rule. Our enemy, says, may also be compared in his manner of acting to a false lover. This takes us back actually to an incident I referred to briefly when we were looking at Ignatius' life. Because after he left Arevalo and went to Pamplona before the cannonball incident, he was in trouble in Pamplona, and within the last few years, I don't know where it appeared, but a letter was discovered in which an official is appealing to the king to say that Inigo Loyola is seeking permission to carry arms in the street, because there's a man called Francisco de Oros, who's from Galicia, he's a Gallego, who is threatening to kill him. And so he's seeking authority to carry a sword. And it's reckoned that the reason this man, Ignatius has tried to be reconciled with him, it says in the letter, but it's pretty clear that the reason the man is so angry at Ignatius is that Ignatius had some kind of inappropriate relationship, let's say, either with a man's wife or his daughter. This is before Ignatius' conversion, of course. And it's almost certain that that's where he draws that image from, because he was the false lover. He was the one that wanted kept secret, as any false lover does. Some of you might know that from experience as well, for all I know. Well, look at the ceiling. So it's a very simple rule which all counsellors would recognise now. Again, this would not have been so obvious in the 16th century, but he says desolation must always be exposed to the light. You should always speak to somebody. Don't let it remain secret, because as long as it's secret, it's like it does great harm. So expose it to the light. And again, that came out of his experience, like everything else. And the third one is that the enemy, it's the conduct of our enemy may also be compared to the tactics of a leader intent upon seizing and plundering a position he desires. Again, it's from his experience, from his military experience. He says that a general who wants to take a position obviously will reconnoitre. We're talking here about fortified positions, towns with walls around them and all the rest of it. And he says the general will reconnoitre, He will try to find the weak point, and he will attack at the weak point. So the person who's defending has to know what his weak point is, and is to make sure that all his troops aren't at the strong point, and there's nobody guarding the weak point. So the weak point, Ignatius says, you have to know what it is. Know when you're vulnerable. Know how you work, how you function. Know the ways in which desolation attacks you, how it gets at you. What buttons to press on you. You have to know yourself. And again, all of this would be second nature to modern psychology and modern counselling and so on. But Ignatius, as I keep saying, had phenomenal insights into all this in the 16th century. So you have to know your weakness. You have to keep it guarded. Okay? So you never make decisions. You wait until desolation passes. You act against it. You deal with it as quickly as you can. You expose it to the light, and you understand yourself well enough to know the ways and the points at which you yourself are vulnerable. And just think for a moment what a difference it would make, perhaps in your own life. Perhaps you can think of times when you've acted out of desolation. But just think of the world, the desolation that the world functions out of so often. And as I said, I think at the last meeting, the number of church meetings I've been at over the years where a group has talked itself into desolation and then take a decision. You cannot make a good decision under those circumstances. So those basically are the rules for the first week. But I want to look as well at the rules for the second week of the exercises. Ignatius says they serve for a more accurate discernment of spirits. The presumption is that the person doing the second week, that the desolation is going to be a bit more subtle than in the earlier stages. And so the discernment has to be more subtle as well. And basically, the rules for the second week are about false consolation. Something that looks like consolation, looks like God, but isn't. Something that seems pious and holy, but inside is as wrong as could be. Something that quotes the scriptures, can tell you chapter and verse, but there's no life in it, it's dead. So it's false consolation. Now, this is something here that we'll come to in the next meeting, but Ignatius talks about consolation without previous cause. Consolation without previous cause, as the name suggests, is consolation that doesn't have a previous cause. In other words, it's a gift, it's a direct gift from God. I'll give you an example of consolation with previous cause. If you're in the church, for example, or somewhere else, and you're listening to a lovely piece of music, it can move you and stir you, right? But there's no guarantee that you're moved and stirred, but that doesn't mean necessarily that it's from God, because music can stir up. Hitler can stir up emotions in people using music. Military music is all designed to do that. As people are going into battle, they play all this military music because it gets them all G'd up, and then they're more ready to kill somebody than they would be without all the military music and the pipes and all that kind of stuff. Going over the top with the pipe play and all that kind of thing. But there are all kinds of other things which constitute previous cause. Ignatius says, though, that if you have consolation without previous cause, and he gives two examples from the Bible, from the New Testament. One is Paul on the road to Damascus, and the other is St. Matthew. I think I said at another meeting, some Jesuits argue about how common without previous cause is. I would personally go along with those who say that it's quite common. Much more common than we think. But it's one of those moments of insight which is so clear, so powering, so powerful, that you you cannot seriously question whether it's from God or not. And if that happens, Ignatius says, and we'll look at that the next time, you can make a decision on the basis of that. But apart from that, God alone can give consolation without previous cause. That's why you can act on it. But if a consolation has previous cause, and try and understand the logic of this, and if you're not following it, ask me. If a cause precedes, both the good angel and the evil spirit can give consolation to a soul, but for quite different purposes. And this is when it becomes most dangerous and most subtle. When people haven't experienced it, automatically think it's of God, just because it has kind of an element of holiness and piousness about it, and there's all the things I've said already, quoting the scriptures. But it's not what it appears. It's an angel of light. It's the devil disguised as an angel of light. And Ignatius says he begins by suggesting thoughts that are suited to a devout soul and ends by suggesting his own. Now it doesn't go straight from good to bad. It's very important, this, because you have to, if you want to know where a movement in you comes from, and you can't identify where it comes from, see where it's taken you, and that'll tell you where it's come from. So the normal movement from this kind of false consolations that work in a person's life is that they go from good, not to bad, but from good to less good. And then to less good, and then to less good, and then to less good, until it very quickly begins to develop into something that is clearly bad. And when you notice that, Ignatius says, that's very important if you notice that. And he says what you must do is, you must go back over that experience. You have to go back and try and identify how it began. How were you fooled? What went on? Trace the whole thing from the beginning. The beginning, he says, the middle and the end. Don't worry about it. Just notice that it happened to you. That for a while perhaps you were conned by it. So why was that? Did it attack you at some weak point? Whatever. But always reflect on, always learn from experience, so that the next time it happens, you'll recognize it. Learning from the experience. When the enemy of our human nature has been detected and recognized with the trail of evil marking its course, we talk sometimes about the tail of the snake, you just catch the tail of the serpent from Genesis. You just catch the tail of the snake nipping around the corner, You just spot it just as it goes. These are just images, of course. It will be profitable for the one who has been tempted to review immediately the whole course of the temptation. Review immediately the whole course of it. Don't get down about it. Just say, now see what happened then. How did that happen? How did it start? What caused it? What fooled me? Take the experience seriously. He gives a couple of important clues. And I think this is a particularly important one. It's a famous one. He says that the good spirit is like water dropping on a sponge. Whereas the bad spirit, he says, is like water dropping on a stone. It's not an infallible way of judging, but it's a good indication. With the good spirit, the Spirit of God, there's a gentleness about it. Whereas the bad spirit, there's a quality of violence. And it often shows in fanaticism. People who, on the surface, are quoting the Bible and saying all kinds of holy things, but they're trying to ram it down everybody's throat. Jesus doesn't do that. God doesn't do that. As we know ourselves, never rams anything down the throat of God. He just kind of gently offers, and it's up to you whether you take it or not. But this kind of fanaticism, there was a time when we had two classic examples of it, when we had George Bush and Osama bin Laden, each of them claiming that God was guiding them. We just had to look to see how godless the whole thing actually was. But it doesn't have to be just fanaticism that leads to violence, like terrorism and so on. It can be harshness, harshness in our judgment. Even if it's only going on in our heads. That harshness, that lack of compassion, that lack of gentleness, that lack of tolerance and so on, which is often associated with religious people, isn't it? I mean, a religious fanatic is a well-known phrase. Although for some people it means folk who take God seriously, who actually pray and things like that. But we're talking about a different kind of quality of violence. And Ignatius says, no matter how holy it looks, no matter how pious it sounds, and it could be, and often would be, the Pope himself or the Curia in Rome or whatever it is, or the parish priest or anybody, or the pillar of the church, who's standing there every week, running the parish, if there's that quality of violence, that kind of friction instead of the gentleness of the water on the sponge, then have another look at it. This is a very important one, he says. Beware too of the afterglow. I'll just read it again. But the spiritual person who has received such a consolation without previous cause, he's talking about, must consider very attentively and most cautiously distinguish the actual time of the consolation from the period which follows it. Now this is a crucial thing. I don't know if it will make sense to you. You need to think back in your own experience. But it's very common for people to have a powerful experience of God. Not, a real experience of God. And then the experience, which they don't last very long anyway, they pass, but there's an afterglow. And during the period of the afterglow, it's quite common for people to invent stuff and then attribute it to the consolation. Does that make sense? But it's not part of the consolation. They've brought it in themselves during the afterglow of the consolation. And one which I've come across many, many, many times is people have an experience of God. And then, what it says, what's that, consider? It's funny, I looked at that and I saw consider, but it says consider. I need to go back and correct some of these. They jump to conclusions about what that means. You have an experience of God and you think, oh God, that means I'll have to go to Africa and work in Africa, or I'll have to do this, or I'll have to do that, or God's asking me to do this, or telling me to do that. You've got to be very, very wary of that. Because during that time of afterglow, you're vulnerable to that kind of mistake. Does that make sense to you? The purpose of all this, of course, is to sift through and understand our own inner experiences with a view to making good decisions at every step of our life's journey. And that, I hope you remember from the last time. Ignatian spirituality, fundamentally, it's apostolic. And that does not mean that it's not mystical, because it's about seeing God in everything. Nothing can be more mystical than that. But it's apostolic. It has consequences. So in the end, Ignatian spirituality is about making decisions, small decisions and big decisions. In the course of a day, we've lots of decisions to make, very small ones. And it is possible to approach them all in a discerning way. And that's what all this is about. It's only if, like the examine, it's only if we're reflecting on an experience, it's only if we're taking an experience seriously, it's only if we're learning to distinguish between consolation and desolation, and we're learning how to deal with desolation, because there'll be plenty of it around in our lives at times. So it's only if we understand that some things that look like God aren't God, that all that glitters is not gold stuff. It's only if we're growing in understanding of all that that we have a chance of making good decisions. You understand that? Does that make sense? And so the next meeting is about discerning God's will. It's about making decisions. I said at the beginning, it's an act of faith. It's about trusting our own experience, testing our own experience, and then living out of our own experience. Does that make sense? Now, of course, there are other factors which we haven't mentioned, and we don't really, I mentioned them in one of the other meetings. Obviously, one of the ways in which we test our experience, and we'll look at a lot of that next month, but one of the obvious ways that we test our experience is against the gospel. If God seems to be inviting us to do something that's not consistent with the gospel and the teaching of Jesus, then it's time to have another look. So there are things outside of ourselves as well which help us to test our own experience. But fundamentally, we're talking about testing our inner experience. And there's my last question: is the Pope a Jesuit? Because this is a quote which Margaret will be familiar with from Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel, and I'll just read it to you. It is not for the Pope, he says, to offer a detailed and complete analysis of contemporary reality, but I do exhort all the communities to an ever watchful scrutiny of the signs of the times. That was an encyclical of Pope Paul VI called Ecclesiam Suam, which was all about reading the signs of the times. We need to distinguish clearly what might be a fruit of the kingdom from what runs counter to God's plan. This involves not only recognizing and discerning spirits, but also, and this is decisive, choosing movements of the spirit of good and rejecting those of the spirit of evil. That's a Jesuit speaking, isn't it? That's Ignatian speaking. That's what we've been saying all evening. And it's very clear in everything that he does that Pope Francis comes out of that tradition. And so next month we'll look at how we make those decisions. Okay. So maybe you would like to, maybe we can chat for a few minutes and then we'll see if there's any questions that you want to ask or any points that you want to make, any clarifications. So you can talk about, just relax for a minute. The very, very latest. We'll be gone by 9 o'clock, and we could be gone in 5 minutes. Is there any comment that anybody wants to make, or any question that you want to ask? Right.
Well, I was wondering just what is the point of desolation, and is it possible to enjoy desolation?
You mean enjoy being miserable? You mean? Yes, absolutely. The person who's at the beginning, whose life is heading away from God. Remember what it said. There are a couple of things there in your question. That's the first point. Yeah, the bad spirit fills their imagination with sensual delights and gratifications, the more readily to keep them in their vices and increase the number of their sins. So the person who's drifting away from God, the bad spirit will encourage that, you know, and there will be short-term apparent satisfaction from it, like having the drink, you know what I mean?
But is there not, by experiencing those points of desolation and recognising them, is there not then that you enjoy the points of consolation
we
better?
benefit from it.
Benefit
Yeah,
from
sorry, I thought you meant enjoy the action.
No, not just
Well, actually, there's a rule here which I didn't read out. I kept them simple. But Ignatius actually gives 3 reasons why we suffer from desolation, right? I didn't read them out because I don't like the second one very much, but never mind. It belongs to a different age. The principal reason is, he says, why we suffer from desolation are 3. The first is because we have become tepid and slothful or negligent in our prayers and practice, so that through our own fault, spiritual consolation has been taken away from us. Okay? But the second one is the one I don't like. The second reason is because God wishes to try us. Haven't we heard that?
Yeah.
He tries to try us. I don't think God tries us. To see how much we're worth and how much we will advance in His service and praise when left without the generous reward of consolation. The third reason is because God wishes to give us a true knowledge and understanding of ourselves. To understand, it's through desolation that we understand that everything is grace, that everything is gift. You cannot give yourself spiritual consolation. You cannot decide when it will start, you cannot decide when it will stop. It's consolation. Because it's all pure gift. And I think that's partly what you said there, that when you don't have it, it makes you appreciate better when you do have the consolation. I don't like the idea of trying us. There might be a different way of putting that, of teaching us, I think. Does that make sense? Yeah. Anything else? Is it all clear?
Yes.
I actually thought quite long it was quite hard to follow.
You found it hard to follow?
Some of it, yeah, some of it was quite hard to follow.
So
I feel as if I need time to digest it.
So which parts were those?
But I had a question, and I thought at the time I must remember that. But it was a bit about the
I was going to point
that. I found very
Without previous
I
cause.
found that very.
Well, I mean, it is, people write a lot about it. It's easier to understand without previous cause if you look at with previous cause. I mean, all kinds of things can cause you to have certainly human consolation and even spiritual consolation. Actually, I missed out an absolutely fundamental point there, actually, which I mentioned before, but I must go back to it. And I'll do it now in case I forget. The essence of spiritual consolation is that it builds up faith, hope and love. I said that last time. The essence of spiritual desolation is that it undermines faith, hope and love. And so when we're searching around inside, when we're sifting through all our feelings, on all the stuff that's going on inside us, what we're looking for is a movement which is building up faith, hope and love. And the reason for that is that, I said this before as well, that according to traditional Catholic theology, and other churches would go along with that as well, faith, hope and love are what were known as theological virtues, so only God can stir up faith, hope and love, right? And so if you can find that movement of faith, hope and love which is stirring those in you, then you have the infallible movement of God, because it's the only place it can come from. Does that make sense? The bad spirit undermines them. However, what Ignatius is saying when he talks about consolation without previous cause, remember, just let me go back a little bit. God alone can give consolation without previous cause. it's with previous cause, if there's a previous cause, in other words, if you can identify that it grew out of some ordinary experience, like a piece of music. You know, people can, it's one of the reasons why I'm never sure what to do with music during silent prayer. Some people find music quite helpful during silent prayer. There is a danger attached to music, is that it can stir up feelings, which you kind of might think were of God, and they might not be really. They might be just, somebody who didn't believe in God could have the same feelings with the same music. You know? So I'm not saying we shouldn't use music sometimes in our prayer. Clearly in the liturgy there's a constant need for music. But you've just got to watch that it's not stirring up something artificially. There's nothing wrong with it stirring stuff. You've got to make sure you don't jump to the conclusion that that's a movement of God. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Because if it has a previous cause, it could be stirred by a different spirit entirely. And I gave the example of the Nuremberg rallies and all that kind of stuff. All that music was used to stir up very, very ungodly stuff. And I think all military music is actually designed to do that. So there's nothing wrong with having good feelings that go with music, but just be careful, because they have a previous cause. You have to be more careful with them. Whereas, the main consolation without previous cause which I had in my life, I've told you before, happened when I was 11 years of age. If I doubted that, I'd have to doubt my whole life, because it was so clear, and it was so utterly that, and that was it. And Ignatius says, when you have something that's as clear as that, then you don't need to do any more discerning. You can trust that experience. But some people would say those are few and far between, and so all the other experiences have to be sifted through more carefully to see what's actually causing them. And the best example, of course, is the religious person who is ramming things down people's throat, who's filled with judgment of anybody who doesn't think the way they think, and is fanatical. That's a very obvious example of something that's a false consolation. Does that make sense, Kate?
I think also the word desolation, consolation that we use normally about everything is a confusion as well.
That's why the spiritual consolation is spirit. I think actually Ignatius's rules can equally be applied to any kind of desolation.
Yes.
If you're in a bad mood and you're seeing the world through very dark spectacles, then don't make decisions. But Ignatius, while that's true, Ignatius is talking about spiritual consolations, so things that are moving, stirring up faith, open love. But most of the rules apply to ordinary consolations as well.
Yeah, that was confusing as well.
Ordinary
It
desolation.
reflects your idea of desolation.
Yeah.
But what about if you have to make the decision, if stuff happens in your life when you're in a period of desolation? So that's when you get the job offer, or that house comes up that you're thinking about, or the proposal comes. What if that's when you have to make a decision?
We will look at those things the next time, but one of the prerequisites for any proper discernment is a willingness to go through the process. You don't just make major decisions just because you're looking for consolation and desolation. You're looking for a pattern which develops over a period of time. You're looking to see, not to be praying about that particular issue all the time, but to be carrying on with your normal prayer, focusing on Jesus and the Gospels and so on. But as you do so, you have a little look to the side to see how your will is inclining while you're in spiritual consolation, right? How does it look? Like, for example, you reflect on your prayer and think that, there was 1,000 spiritual consolation there. So how did the decision look at that point? Okay. Now, the bigger the decision, this will make it into next month, but the bigger the decision, the more time it needs. You're looking you're looking at, if you get a pattern that every time you're in consolation, your will inclines that way. And if that becomes a real pattern, then Ignatius says, you have to also look for confirmation, which we'll look at next month as well. But Ignatius says that you can know what God is inviting you to. Doesn't mean to say you have, you can do what you like, but God is revealing His will to you. However, we're back to the whole thing as an act of faith. That only makes sense if you accept the basic premise of Ignatius, which is that God is communicating with each of us all the time, and it is possible for us to know what God is saying to us. If you don't believe that, then nothing that we've said tonight makes any sense. And so one of the things we'll again say next month is, we just wait, we'll just have next month. You cannot discern God's will on the basis that you'll find out what it is first and then decide that you're going to do it. Because if that's your attitude, you do not have the freedom, the indifference necessary to begin the process at all. You can only discern God's will if you're committed to implementing it once you find out what it is. You can't say, well, I'll decide later. You can do that if you like, but it muddies the waters. It means that you don't have the necessary attitudes to make a good discernment. So it involves a period of prayer. I mean, there are small decisions that we have to make each day when you can't go off on a 6 weeks retreat to make it. You just have to develop a way of doing that. But a major decision, like applying for a job or whether you're going to marry somebody or not, or whether you're going to leave somebody or not. The more serious the question, the more commitment there has to be to the process. And in Ignatius' understanding, you have to be talking that out with somebody who understands the process, to guide you and look out for things that you might not see yourself. Because the bigger the decision, the more important it is we know our weak points, we know where we're vulnerable, we know what our prejudices are, we know what baggage we're bringing into the situation. The freer you can become of all that, the clearer the decision can be. But I repeat, if you don't accept the premise, then it makes no sense. So what you're throwing back on other ways of making decisions. You can toss a coin or ask all your pals what they think, or do what somebody else tells you. Or you can discern them. Anything else? Even if it's just something that you like, something that yeah, that's true, I like that.
Can I ask Joe, you mentioned there, I won't ask too much about it, but the experience when you were 11 years old, so you had an experience, and then did you make a pretty quick decision that whatever you were feeling or the direction was correct, and yes, okay, I'm going to do that, or did you then question and challenge?
No, there didn't have to be a decision. It was so clear. It was so overwhelmingly clear. And it was only a decision at that point. I mean, there have been many decisions since, but it was so clear. I mean, I've told some of you before, but I'll tell you again very briefly. It was in the spring of 1957, came home from school, played football across the road. It got so dark we couldn't see the ball, so we went home. And I'm walking up the back stairs of the house. It was dark, and when the door opened, I remember the yellow light. I mean, it's all so vivid. And I stepped in, my mother was standing there making chips. I walked past her, I was walking past her into the living room, and she said these words: "Father Conway was here to see if you do want to go to Blair's." The strangest thing about it is that there were many negative things came from that experience. But, I don't mean the experience that, I mean going to Blair's. But at that moment, with one foot in the living room and one foot in the kitchen, it's so vivid, I knew with absolute certainty that the answer to that question was yes. It wasn't rational. It hadn't come through any process. It was like that. So that's not it was water dropping in a stone. But it was utterly clear. Right? So there was no decision to be made. It was just you knew the answer. Ignatius talks about deep interior knowledge.
Man, know thyself, and to the sharing self be true.
Yes, well, I mean, the only thing is Ignatius was saying all these things centuries before anybody else
I know
was.
this is a genius of that.
Yeah. Does that answer your question, Rob?
I think so. I guess I was wondering, after that experience, but you didn't test it or think, oh, hang on a minute, that's not the right thing, did you?
The test? Well, there was no need to test it at that point because the decision was. It's hard to describe how clear it was. But obviously, that took me into a process which lasted for years and is still going on. And there have been many times. I mean, when I was doing, this is getting very personal now, but when I was doing the spiritual exercises at the beginning, I was really, really angry with God about that. Because it was the first week of the exercises, and I felt seduced, I felt conned. And I remember, I mean, it was a spiritual desolation, but I remember being really angry. Why couldn't I just have the same life as everybody else? And that kind of passed at work its way through, but 2 or 3 weeks later, at the end of the exercises, I was sitting on this hill above St Vinyls looking over North Wales, and I mean, it was funny, it was laughable really, because it just became so clear how God was in the whole story, good and bad. There were lots of things in the story which were not good, but it didn't matter, because that's true of us all. And God just showed me His presence in it all. It was one of those moments which I've experienced again. You know, they say that when you're drowning, you know your whole life passes. But it was a moment like that. But maybe some of you have experiences like this you would want to share with the group.
Maybe next month's job.
Well, thanks very much. We'll still see some of the Manchester United.